Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me okay with the music. We're going to be having a discussion today about a resource that's going to launch in 2 days. And the resource is called an Apparel Supplier's Guide to Key Sustainability Legislation in the EU, US, and UK. And Ilishio is going to tell, I'm going to introduce the panelists in a minute, but Ilishio is going to be telling a little bit more about this resource shortly, who was involved, why it was created, and what we found. But before I hand over to Ilishio, I'm just going to introduce everybody here. To my right, actually they're all to my right, but we have Zishan Ahmed from NDL in Pakistan. And Zishan was not involved explicitly in the resource that we're going to be talking about today, but he's going to be sharing some of his questions and insights as Ilishio presents. And NDL has, of course, been a big supporter of Transformers Foundation. And then Ilishio Lovejoy of Simple Approach, who, as I mentioned, was one of the key actors involved in bringing this resource to life. And there will be more on that in a minute. And then we have also Danijela Cafuta of Lenzing, Lenzing is one of the founders of Transformers Foundation. And like Zishan, she'll be listening to the presentation and sharing her insights about this space as we go along. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. I can also introduce myself briefly. My name is Kim, and I am the Intelligence Director for Transformers Foundation. And Transformers Foundation was also involved in creating this, in supporting the resource that we're about to talk about with you here today. So we're going to have a brief presentation from Ilishio. We're going to have some discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and a conversation with all of you. All right, on that note, okay. Oh, do you want me to go to the who first?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Kim. So I'm just going to, as Kim said, I'll talk you through who put together the resource, why we put the resource together, and a little bit of the kind of very top-level findings of this resource, because it ended up being a 100-page document, so I can't dive into the detail today, sadly. But as Kim mentioned, it is going to be available publicly in 2 days' time, and what we really hope here is that we'll drive a bit of interest for you and your teams to dive into that. And I will caveat that by saying we're also going to release the fact sheets in separate documents, so you don't have to tackle the 100-page report all in one go. So a little bit about who. Sorry, I'm going to be looking up. The resource was put together predominantly by suppliers who are in our business operations competitors, but in the space of legislative development and the supply chain, we felt that there was a joint benefit for us and all other suppliers to actually better understand the space and legislation coming. So the suppliers involved were Epic Group, Norlanka, Shahi Exports, Simple Approach, and we partnered with Transformers Foundation and a human rights specialist called Every, who is not on the slide. GIZ FABRIC also financially supported the project as well. So it was a supplier, what we called a supplier steering committee with Transformers Foundation, who are obviously representing the suppliers from the denim industry, who came together to create this resource. We commissioned the Remedy project to write the resource for us, and the reason we chose the Remedy project is that they are an NGO looking at legislation, human rights due diligence, worker well-being, but the entire organization are ex-corporate lawyers. So we really worked with legal professionals to try to answer some of the questions that suppliers have around upcoming legislation. So that's who's been involved in it. Why? I touched upon this, but the resource is intended to enable suppliers whom are predominantly operating outside of Europe, the US, and the UK, where all of this legislation, people are calling it a legislative wave, is being developed. But a lot of the suppliers who are going to be either directly or very, we call it indirectly, but still very directly impacted by this legislation are not as aware of it coming. So we saw a gap there, that there's a lot of legislation coming and the supply chain are not as well informed on it or engaged in that process. And that's really the why we decided to do this piece of work. The report is the first of its kind, I think, in this space. We see a lot of collaboration amongst brands, MSIs, NGOs doing reports, but actually we've been told a few times this is the first time suppliers are coming together to do this, but I think by no means do we hope this is the last effort. We are already potentially talking about other white papers from a supplier perspective, and I will come around to that at the end as well, but we are really looking to bring other suppliers on board. So if this is something that is interesting for you, please do speak to myself or Kim afterwards, because it's not a select group. It was just the group that wanted to step forward and do this, and we would really encourage others to join us. And we hope that this resource will build supplier collaboration and agency within the policy discourse, which I think all of us felt was lacking before we did the research, and we feel even more strongly that that is lacking now. So it's not only about understanding how this is going to impact us, it's also understanding, can we have a say in how the legislation that will impact us is actually developed as well. Which legislation we covered, I think there was a really valid point that you already brought up, Danijela, via email, which we left out a lot of really important legislation, and that was purely just based on budget and resource, and we had to narrow it down for this first instance, and we really wanted to, both Kim and I wanted to focus on actualizing the project rather than it getting too big, too expensive, and us not being able to get there. And as we said, we see potential for that to grow, and we're hoping that others want to support that growth as well. So the reason that we narrowed it down is that's why there's 12, is really a budget thing. But how we narrowed that down, we actually started by crowdsourcing a long list, so we could then vote on which legislation to cover. And as the slide says above me, I think, yes, we mapped over 60 different legislations that can potentially impact the value chain of the apparel industry and beyond. And we had to just go through a kind of voting process of the suppliers involved to see which ones we wanted to focus on. And that was really based on the salience of how large an impact we felt that legislation was going to have, obviously without doing the deep dive research yet. Also how fast that's coming, and also potentially the focus of that topic, okay? So whether it's forced labor, whether it's really salient issues that we're all focusing on anyway. And that was kind of our filter, you could say, for then each company voting on what they felt was right. And we came out with these 12 legislations that, as I mentioned, the report covers all of them, and each one is its own fact sheet. So you can dive into just one of these if it's of interest. Highlights and trends from the report. I think overall, all the suppliers involved panicked at the beginning because what we really felt amongst all of them is that there is just going to be a really large increase on demands coming down the value chain. And that's going to be predominantly for visibility and full supply chain transparency. We are hearing of suppliers who are already being asked about that a lot. We're also expecting that it's going to really increase the reporting requirements for the entire value chain. And this is really, some of this legislation is talking about farm level, okay? So legislators think that sounds simple, but I think everybody in this room will hopefully understand that that is actually a lot of work that's being set out across several different legislations that we'll all be complying with. Another major thing that stood out for us is that both EU countries, some of the legislation can be interpreted differently amongst EU countries, and within those countries, you will have different customers, brands that are potentially going to interpret this legislation differently as well and implement that differently. So there is a lot of risk of duplication being required. So when we talk about full supply chain transparency, you may have to do that in several different ways for different customers, depending on how this gets perceived and implemented. I think I've covered most of it. We're also seeing that there's going to be an increased expectation for suppliers to implement due diligence processes. I think everybody hopefully here is familiar with due diligence term. It comes from the OECD due diligence guidance and is running through most of the upcoming legislation. And I think I've covered most of it. So to move on, I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of our recommendations that came from that and came from the discussions whilst we were looking at the findings. And I don't think they'll come as a surprise based off of what I've just said. But if possible, discuss the implications and your plans with your brands and customers, because as I said, it's really going to mean potentially entirely different things. We're hearing of some brands who are just not engaging with that yet. So suppliers are having to really decide, how do we put these due diligence processes in place ourselves? Other brands are having really, really strict systems. So really, if the opportunity is there, discuss upcoming legislation with your customers. And we're hoping that this resource kind of enables that conversation and maybe gives you a starting point to say, can we have a discussion about which ones are you focusing on? What's your plans there? The other thing that we recommend is allocate sufficient resources to understanding and proactively responding to this legislation. I think myself, at least, I know you are, we're in the sustainability team, and this goes way beyond your sustainability teams. This is going to require your legal teams to be involved, your HR teams, and your product teams. So really a message for us to all value chain players is look at this as a holistic business change, because it will impact all kind of areas of the business. And I think lastly, and hopefully there's still time for this, seek out ways, and we say this is simple, this is not simple, but please engage with other suppliers and look for ways to actually interact with the legislative development process, because as we've been finding out and will continue to find out, the technical expertise of the supply chain it's kind of assumed that is there in the legislative process, but it may not actually be, and that's going to have really, really big implications for taking a document into a day-to-day business operation. And I think hopefully...
Can I just add one thing about the way that Ilishio mentioned there's 12 fact sheets, and each fact sheet is structured in the same way. There's different sort of categories of information, and one of those categories of information is about this point. So is there still potential, like is it still possible to shape the development of this law, or is it already set in stone? And so that's one of the things that we really hope will come out of this is, because as Ilishio said, it's very apparent, having looked now in detail at these pieces of legislation, that there's really a lack of understanding about how apparel supply chains actually work. Sorry.
No, thank you. Also, I'm sure you'll both have lots to add that I'm missing, but I'll get through the slides so I can face everyone again. And finally, I just want to end with a slide just talking a little bit about the bigger picture. I think I have mentioned this as well. This was really a starting point for us. We knew that this is by no means extensive in covering everything that we needed to, but we wanted to see whether we could bring suppliers together in a pre-competitive space and work together in that way, and whether there is still room for engagement. And a few key takeaways on the kind of bigger picture is that I think, sadly, a lot of the legislation we felt still encourages the top-down approach to value chain management. And we would recommend that we start to move away from this. It's a little bit counterproductive, actually. I think I should have caveated at the beginning by saying none of the suppliers involved are anti-legislation, but we really would like legislation that is informed and implementable, and that is what we're calling for there. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of it is looking at the top-down approach to supply chain management, and we would encourage more of a equitable conversation from the beginning and around how this will now be implemented. Involve the production experts. I've said that several times, but I think Kim also hinted at that. A lot of the legislation, when you read it, if you do dive into the really long legislative documents, you can quite immediately tell that there have not been supply chain experts writing this, and they may not understand how businesses function on the day-to-day level. So we would really recommend, for any opportunities there are, to look at legislative development or the guidance, because what will happen from some of this is already passed, but there will now be a big move around guidance. How do you implement this? And we'd really, really hope that people involve the entire supply chain, because you're working with materials, I'm working with finished goods. We'll have a completely different day-to-day operations and what that means for us. And I think we fear that much of the legislation covered in the fact sheets will serve to shift legal from brands to their suppliers rather than spark meaningful change. So what we're already hearing is people are coming back into how do we legally protect our business? How do we have stronger contracts? How do we look at legal liability? And that's really sad and disheartening to see after COVID. For those of you who followed that space, COVID-19 had massive implications on human rights within the value chain because of contractual clauses. And actually what a lot of this legislation is maybe unintentionally encouraging is a shift towards that again of legal liability. Focus on contracts, who is going to be held legally liable when something goes wrong, instead of saying there are things wrong with supply chains and how do we partner to improve this. And I'm going to stop there. Hopefully I haven't missed anything.
Thank you, Ilishio. All right. I want to give Danijela and Zishan a chance to respond. I mean, first, is there any clarification questions that you want to ask? I mean, about what the project did, what the outcome was, or is that all clear?
Which regulation or directive was feared the most? So,
which regulation was feared the most?
Was there a tendency to discuss one more than the other?
I think the Corporate Due Diligence Sustainability Act is on everybody's mind, because I think that's the one being discussed most in Europe. But actually, I think if you ask the suppliers, I think it really comes back to the fact that we all have different contexts, and there are different ones that are likely going to impact us more.
What I would maybe add to that too is that a lot of the discussion that we had a lot of discussions, sure, about this legislation or that legislation, but actually what I think we had the most discussions about was trying to understand, and you'll see when you look at these fact sheets, like I mentioned, there's sort of standard criteria or categories of information for each of the legislation, and one of them is how do you know whether you're in scope or not? And we had so many conversations as a group of industry apparel suppliers looking at the legal text of these various pieces of legislation and trying to understand, so are we in scope or are we not in scope? And to be honest, it was like some of the conditions around whether you would be directly in scope or not be directly in scope were like really nuanced and fine points, and we tried to make that as clear as possible in the fact sheets themselves. But I think that was also a really a really big point of discussion. And then if you're not directly in scope, as Ilishio was mentioning at the end, that you could still be legally liable even if you're not directly in scope because of the way that, you know, these contracts are coming in some cases from brands and retailers that are sort of pushing legal responsibility off onto their suppliers. Zishan.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting us and share our thoughts about the EU and US legislation. So first, I would like to ask, is there any certain deadlines have been defined? After these deadlines, the industry, the whole supply chain industry should be follow the norms which has been set by this legislation? The first question. And the second question, at the moment, I mean, if we talk about the European country, EU countries, every country has own rules and regulation. After approval of these legislation, the whole European country they follow the same rules. For instance, if we talk about the France is taking lead at the moment, and their brands and their supply chain start asking about their requirement. They want to have minimum 20% sustainable element in the final product, either it's a home apparel or it's a home textile or apparel industry. Thank you.
So the second question is about the potential for standards that don't align, correct? And the first question, it's about the timeline for...
is there any certain deadlines has been defined? It's up to 2025 or 2030.
Oh, for implementing.
Yeah, exactly,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
After the certain deadlines, brands or supply chain will not allow to do, without any, they cannot violate that regulations.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to start?
I can start with the implementation timelines. That's different for each one. I think I'm not an expert in EU legislative development, but it can legislation can be nominated and drafted by different parties. And so the timelines are really varied. It depends when they start that. It depends how long it takes them to get it off the ground. There's several rounds of voting. So what's really key is when it gets passed. And then what we saw is with some of them that are passed or they do give indications, there's between a 2 and a 4 year, I think, window between when it's passed and when it's implementing. And some of them actually have different brackets depending on the business's size. So it might be that large companies within the EU have to implement this within 2 years, whereas smaller companies within the EU or who are outside of the EU have 4 years. But I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly because each one is different there.
But the fact sheets will tell you, because we have, again, one of the categories of information on these fact sheets is what's the status. So where in the legislative development process is it? And we've given some indication of how likely we think it is to pass, and then also the timeline for that, where that's possible. But again, these are estimations. But none of us can see into the future. And we did that, as Ilishio mentioned, with the Remedy Project, who are lawyers, who are the ones who we worked with to author this
report.
For the question on your second question,
at the moment, you guys are trying to bring all the supply chain partners on board, so where they can share their ideas, their thoughts. Is there any plan to bring the brands? They can come up and they can also share their requirement, their expectation, what they're expecting, because they have a first-hand information, because they are interacting with the end consumer. So end consumer thoughts or end consumer requirement is really essential, so the industry can understand the consumer requirements as well. So my question is there any idea or is there any plan to bring the brands on board where they can share their requirement as well?
I think we wanted to start with this, and this was actually a pretty heavy lift, and then it's about where does this go next. But one of the conversations we've definitely had is how can we use this to have the conversations with the brands. because they are a key part of this. But when we looked at partners of, let's say, who could review the report, etc., we really felt it was important that this was done by suppliers for suppliers, because brands will have a very particular point of view on legislation, which is really important for suppliers to understand. But I think also our own lens is also important. So I think we wanted to first develop the resource and then look at ways to engage brands with that, if that answers.
Maybe I can add to that as well that one of the report launches in 2 days, and one of the hopes is that if it generates a lot of interest, both from the supplier side, but also maybe from the brand side, that we can leverage that interest to also start to convene some of these conversations. You know, for example, maybe we could host a workshop between a group of brands and a group of suppliers trying to get alignment on interpretation on a key piece of legislation, right? But all of that is sort of what comes next and depends on the level of interest that we have in this resource, especially, to be honest, from the supplier side. So we really hope that you guys look at it, engage with it, and tell us if you're interested, because as Ilishio said, it's really a unique collaboration amongst frankly very fierce competitors, and I really think that the legislative space is really one where as suppliers we need to be coming together to work collectively on these issues that affect all of us. Because to your other question about sort of different EU states having different interpretations, it's not only different EU states, it's also different brands, and that was one of the things that came out very strongly as a key risk for suppliers, is that different brands are going to interpret these requirements very differently, and it's going to sort of exponentially translate into requirements for the supply chain. I want to shift and ask Danijela and Zishan, but we'll start maybe with Danijela. Like, have you been facing pressure or having conversations internally as a company about how to get a head start on sort of these legislative developments? And what are some of the implications, the key implications of these sustainability-related legislations that you're looking at within your operations?
Of course, we have our discussions, but usually we know, because we are the raw material supplier, usually we are, let's say, at the end or at the beginning of the value chain. Yeah. So if you look, we get much more requests, data requests, than, let's say, direct suppliers to the brands. So because we get like a full wave of requests. So it will definitely be an administrative burden. Yeah, we also believe that the European Union is really tackling the right problems or addressing the right problems. But then you always know when the regulation or directive is introduced, the devil is in the detail. How you everything sounds good, that is actually addressed, but then how this is defined is another question. And here really the details will be decisive. And for details, of course, it's important to listen to everybody, so raw material suppliers, but also manufacturers. Maybe manufacturers from Pakistan or India has a different perspective than someone from China. And so it's definitely, it will affect all of us, And even if we are not directly, just thinking about what I believe will have, like, very, very high impact and very, very high effort is eco-design for sustainable products regulation. Because this will be like a mandatory, it will be for all European countries. So for everyone who places the product on the European market, it will be mandatory to fulfill those requirements. But reading what is known till today, it's super open for interpretation. So you don't really know what exactly in which data is coming. We know it on a very, very high level, but we will know that will affect all of us. Because if you say, for example, durable products. What is durable product? Durable, I don't know. Cosmetics is different than durable textiles. And then on the other side, we have in textiles so many other, functions. Of course, if you have like a very soft and absorbent textiles, it has different durability than for example, textiles from 100% synthetics. Yeah, and there are details, but how they will define that, because how they will give to the consumer the full information. Because I believe what is very nice about the Green Claims Directive, which is not in the scope of your report, but still, discussed very often. We see that they are trying to find a way to give the consumer the full information. So let's say if you say something good from environmental perspective about the product, you also need to say what bad is it causing, because not many things are only good. Yeah. And for example, in terms of eco-design, we really hope that they will also have the full picture, that you will not say just this product is 100% durable, it's greener the greenest, yeah, but on the other side lacks comfort. Yeah, so we really wish that, the holistic approach, and are pushing for that, or let's say trying to convince that we need a holistic approach and not omitting any facts to the consumers. Yeah. But definitely the data that will be behind it will affect the whole value chain.
Yeah, I think that's pretty consistent with some of the discussions between the suppliers commissioning this work. Zishan, what about you? Have you been feeling pushes for anything as a result of the developing legislative context, and what kind of operational implications has it had for you and Naveena and DL?
Thank you very much for asking this question. Yes, of course, we had several discussions in our company how we have to cop this legislation. First, we need to understand what is a legislation. Of course, we are working with the different brands who is in US market and in EU market, and every brand, and having said this, every brand has own requirements. Some brands wants to have more focus on aesthetics. Some brands want to have more sustainable element on it. So first, we need to identify ourselves where we are at the moment. That's why we did one exercise 2 years back, and we have done a LCA, life cycle assessment of the whole process. First, we need to understand where we are at the moment. Our scope is like gate-to-gate scope, and we have done a very detailed exercise, being a fabric manufacturer, what the resources we are consuming to produce 1 meter fabric, how many carbon dioxide is generating, what is the water consumption, what is the energy consumption. And whatever we have to practice, that should be traceable, that should be transparent for every brand. And the data should be accessible for everywhere. Like there's a Higgs index, so we are updating the Higgs index as well. So now I really appreciate to the transformers. They bring this issue on a board, and they are trying to aware to the people and the whole supply chain partner, either the manufacturer or the retailer brands. Thank you.
Thank you, Zishan. I want to open to, are there any questions from the audience? Things that you'd like to ask, or yes? Wait, let me come to you so we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Julian from Milmai Body Shaping. We are producing bra cups for lingerie and swimwear. And just a comment, what I think is important, that like this kind of legislation, how I feel, it's a lot of bureaucracy, and often it's harder for especially smaller companies or suppliers to fulfill these things, or even they fulfill it, but they don't know how to deal with the bureaucracy. And we luckily have a team who's just focused on that. But if you don't have that, we have a few, let's say, our suppliers, they really have issues with handling certain topics. And this is a little bit sad, that often this legislation is, of course, nice for the big ones. And gives a lot of control, gives a lot of transparency for the big brands and the big suppliers. But often for especially the small, let's say medium companies, it's hard. And that is, I think, a really sad thing about it. But yeah, I totally understand it and I know why it's important and so on, but that's just as a comment.
Thank you.
I think I can respond a bit to that actually. So one of the key thing that from the very first time Kim and I spoke about the idea of this was that it is publicly available, because what traditionally happens with legislation such as this, and I know more from brand supply chains, but they are hiring corporate lawyers to do this mapping, to say what is the legislation coming, what are the impacts, how do we protect ourselves? And one thing that we said, no matter what we vote on with this report, we want it to be publicly available. And it was really because of that reason that we are some of the bigger suppliers in this space and we are competitive and we are not even well prepared, but it is going to have really, really severe impacts for smaller suppliers. And really sadly, I think a lot of people are going to be pushed out of the market because the amount of data that you're talking about, if you're not a Lenzing, I don't know how a company will enter the space anymore. And even with us, like, I think we're hoping, I mean, I mentioned it, we're really hoping that people understand you need legal professionals, you need sustainability professionals, you need HR people.
Chemicals.
Yeah, you need chemical professionals. You're going to really need a big team if you're going to actually survive this wave of legislation. And you're right that smaller companies can't necessarily do that. So we are hoping it's not going to solve the problem, but we're hoping that making the resource publicly available will help some of the smaller guys.
Yeah? And oh, thank you, Lisette.
Wonderful panel. Very informative. I just give you a short intro about myself. I have a background of environmental intelligence in supply chain. And in my 15 years of experience in India in 2005 and 6, when there was a big, bad PR about child labor in supply chain, a lot of brands and Western countries, they forced India to have minimum wages, and there are like 12 different changes were done, and Indian government, they did. And what happened, like one state, Tamil Nadu, they made minimum wage $200. And everybody says, wow, good, well done. But what happened, 99% of the brand, they moved to Bangladesh. So, I mean, all the legislation in Europe and all these things, they actually force suppliers to change. But then they really change, the brands, they fly away. So are you guys also shaming these brands? Do you have any plan for this? Because in Bangladesh, it's going to happen soon.
Do you want me to take that, or do you guys want to take that? Okay. So I'll speak in my capacity as Transformers Foundation. I don't want to put words in the mouths of any of the companies supporting this work or anybody else here on stage. But I think that for me, personally, one of the questions that all of this legislation raises is, to be honest, the business model and the sort of transactional relationship between brands and their suppliers, because a lot of the investments that will need to be made in order to comply with this legislation, okay, some of it is around data, but a lot of it is infrastructural. It's tied to a specific location, to a specific factory, to a specific place. And you can't just pick that up and move it. And so I think that for me, this is one of the big question marks is, I think for a lot of people who are not in production, these are sort of abstract problems. And actually, the reality is that these are problems that are tied to a specific place, to a specific facility, a specific location. And if we want suppliers to make those investments in a specific place, in a specific factory, then they need to have some kind of assurance that their business is still going to exist in that place in 5 years, 10 years. On the topic of decarbonization, for example, I've had suppliers say to me, why would I make these investments in decarbonizing my factory when, frankly, I don't even know if my business will still exist in 10 years? And so I think this is sort of one of the bigger pieces of the conversation is how this legislation, okay, it's well-intentioned, but how do we leverage it to also transform the nature of these commercial relationships? And I think that, again, for us, this is the first step. And we hope that if we use this opportunity to sort of identify who are the people, who are the suppliers who are out there who have an interest in this topic, who want to work together on this topic, then maybe we can see if we can sort of collectively advocate for certain things directly with legislators. And that's sort of, if you ask me for my wish list of what, or my best hope or my dream scenario of what happens as a result of this project, is that there's some sort of collective advocacy that comes out of it. Because right now, it's a huge gap. The industry associations, national manufacturing associations are not filling that gap at the moment, I don't think, anyway, or they're filling it only in a very limited way. I think my experience has been that most of them are more focused on their national context and the political situation and the development in their national context. And I think there's a huge gap right now for some kind of collective voice from the global, apparel supply chain in legislative contexts in the U.S. and in the EU. Do you guys have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I can add 2 quick things, and then I'm curious what the others think as well. I think you touched on a very key point, and Kim did, and the key point you touched on there is this cost neutral, which I think is a really, really dangerous conversation that is being pushed. I think anyone working within the industry probably understands that by now, that we want more and more and better and higher wages and more sustainable machinery and everything else, but we also want lower prices, and that's just kind of impossible in most cases. I think, unfortunately, in the few areas where it has been possible, that is now used to get other suppliers to drop their prices whilst implementing this. And from what we've spoken about, there is nothing that we've spoken about that's going to save money. This will cost more money, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think we need to get away from that conversation of, oh, okay, we can do all of this, but it's going to cost you more, and then they will buy from another country. That's super dangerous. And I think Kim mentioned that having that conversation with brands is really hard on a one brand, one supplier basis. But the potential there is, if there is more suppliers who want to work together pre-competitively, we might be able to raise not only this point, but others too. But I'm curious what you guys think.
The good thing about European Union is that you always have a say. Yeah, so there are public consultation open. Every report that is published, they ask for opinion, and then I would just say yes. Suppliers need collectively or individually. Yeah, you can participate in these public consultations. That's also how we do it. We use every opportunity that affects our business the most to at least have a say. Yeah? If we are hurt, it's another thing, but at the end, at least you have this opportunity. And especially when we look at the textiles, the detailed work is just starting. Yeah, the first consultations
on the PIF, you mean? On the
ESPR, for example, Eco Design started the first public consultation on textiles, where they asked quite a lot of questions. I believe it was in May. It was closed in May, but I believe the further will follow in the coming months. So.
I just thought of one other thing to add, is that in the fact sheets themselves about each piece of legislation, we also made specifically a note of whether those pieces of legislation say anything about purchasing practices. Most of them don't, but there are a couple that do. But then at least that is also, if you go and you look at each of the fact sheets, that should also be clear to you. For example, the New York Fashion Act makes reference to reasonable assistance. So that could be interpreted to mean financial assistance, but it might not. So it's a kind of a wait and see game. How is this term reasonable assistance, if that piece of legislation is passed, first of all, but if it's passed, how does that term reasonable assistance get interpreted? And those kind of like flags and signposts are also included in the fact sheets. I'm conscious that we're actually over time. Oh, we're not? We have a few more minutes? 4 more minutes. Okay. Question? Thanks.
Hi everyone, this is Pelin from EREX Blue Matters. I'm the Sustainability Director of the EREX. I just would like to add to all of these points. We do struggle with all of these things, but I mean, we have to think about the slow fashion also. With the slow fashion, we will have the less quantities. And with the giant capacity of the Bangladesh, India, Turkey, what do you think about it?
So is the question whether any of the pieces of legislation that we looked at will do anything about overproduction?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
At least the term fast fashion is not yet defined. So I believe that for the first, the term fast fashion needs to be defined. I believe the European Union is working on that right now. To say what is slow fashion, you need to know what is fast fashion. Yeah. Yes, we all understand. We all understand what is fast fashion, but if it comes, but the line between fast fashion, slow fashion can be, very blurry. So
yes.
That's why I believe we first need to have like the term, the definition from the European Union when they talk about fast fashion. What I mean by that?
Actually, there are two dimensions of the slow fashion for the sustainability concern. When it comes to earth, environment, okay, it's perfect to have the, slow fashion, to less produce, less recycling, whatever it is. But on the other hand, we have the labor force issue. They will lose their jobs because the companies will be smaller than today. With the less capacity, I mean, both sides is the sustainability side. One is social side, the other side is the environment side.
On the other side, I cannot answer this question at all because I'm not in detail.
Yeah, this is all dilemma. That's why I'm saying.
I'm just saying there will be also new jobs, with recycling, with sorting, with. There are also some expecting some new jobs as well to be created. But as I said, I don't have the full set of data to answer this question.
I would add, in French due diligence, last week they have included a long-lasting fashion. They don't use term fast fashion. And also they have, every company in France, they have a legal responsibility to inform production quantity and the wastage. And what they're doing with unsold item is happening already, but only in France.
Ilishio, Zishan and then Ilishio.
I think we should wait for 2 days. After 2 days, the white paper will be published for everyone, so we can really understand what is the real insight, what is the requirement, and what will be our role. So I think that I'm really excited to see the white paper. It will be published in the next 2 days.
Thank you. To your question, though, specifically about whether any of the legislation seems like it's trying to tackle overproduction, some of the pieces of legislation that we looked at in this report did have criteria around durability, around circularity, things like that. But again, I encourage you to go and look at the details of each fact sheet when they come out in 2 days, because the wording and the language, and this was actually a learning for me in this process, the wording and the language around what the requirements are is so specific and so precise that I think if I tried to summarize it here, I would just be responsible for spreading misinformation. But yes, some of the pieces of legislation that we looked at are seem to have the intention of taking this on. Whether in practice, as we've heard already throughout this session, it will have that impact. I think the devil is in the details, and in our experience in general, what we tended to see was that there was a real disconnect between people who had the sort of operational understanding of the details and the people writing the legislation. Any other questions? I think... No? Any final comments or last words? And there's no pressure or obligation, only if you want to.
No, I can just say, I think, Kim, you touched on it. It's very specific and very vague at the same time. So honestly, even doing the research, I couldn't tell you exactly what my company has to do for each one of those, but I do know that we have a really good starting point to have conversations internally and with our customers, and that's much further than I was half a year ago. But I do encourage those of you who it's going to impact to dive into those fact sheets, and really please give us feedback. This is an experiment. We would love people to get involved. If you think there are legislations that we're not covering that we should be, and you're interested in joining us for that, then please also reach out. And a last shout out would be if it's not your specific job, but there is someone within your company, then please do send them the link. We have actually Kim can talk about that, but we do have a public launch coming up on August 1st, and we really do hope that this gets spread as widely as possible and is as helpful as possible. And encourage engagement and feedback.
Yes, so I'll just close with some logistics. So the paper will be launched in 2 days. You can find it on the Transformers website as well as in a few other places. There'll be a launch webinar on the 1st of August, so and that's virtual, so please do join for that. And there's a registration link for that on the Transformers website. And as Ilishio said, this is the start. We need more fact sheets. These fact sheets covering more pieces of legislation. The fact sheets that we've made, some of them are going to be out of date in 6 months, so they'll need to be updated. So if you have an interest in supporting this work going forward, please do get in touch. Let us know, because that's the momentum that we need to continue to take this work forward. Any final thoughts or last words?
Yeah, actually, as you said and Lisha said, this is just beginning, so we have to go long way. So it's just starting. Just we take off. So we have to fly on a very high altitude, where we have to achieve a lot of goals, sustainable goals or social environmental goals, where we have to make it green our world.
Thank you. And Danijela?
Yes, I also see we need also to see the good side of it, because there is a good side of it, and if we help to make the details right, then we can change something actually for good, because we cannot continue the way we are, doing business now. So we need to change things. So that's and I believe we are also European Union is in a good way, and US. So that's good to see.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your time today, and hopefully we will be talking again soon, and that this is the beginning rather than the end of a conversation. Thank you very much.